things, I'm the person they talk to. When people get upset about things, I have to go talk to them about the exhibit. So I'm basically kind of the, like, like we have an extremely collaborative process, but in the end, someone signs stuff, and that's me. So I generally work on a kind of team that involves me as a developer. I usually work with a 3D designer who is responsible for how people work through the space, how kind of, like making it accessible, making it kind of more of a narrative environment. I usually work with a 2D graphic designer who does panels, does photographs, helps with murals, things like that. I usually work with a project manager who is responsible for schedule and budget, because I should not be in charge of those things. And then we usually have like content researchers. We will have kind of curatorial staff representing our collections. We have people from our marketing department, people from our media department. The specific mix of people depends on what kind of exhibit it is, how big it is, what the components are. If we do an exhibit that doesn't have any collections in it, we don't need anybody from collections, things like that. So, and then I'm responsible for the content of the exhibit as well. So in addition to leading the project, I'm also the person who shapes the narrative. Like, what is the message that each exhibit is telling? That's something that I basically decide, although I'm doing this with like collaboration with other team members, other content experts, other historians. I figure out how we're going to tell this story through objects and photos and other things. I work with the designer to turn that into a dimension, like a narrative environment. And then at the end, like, I write the text for the exhibits, and then other things. So that's my job functionally. So, and I will talk, and I can talk about this later, is that my job is not very common in a lot of exhibits. I work, as you probably saw on the NMHS website, we are a very, very large historical society. We have 27 museums. In theory, 2020 has made that kind of an open question coming up, is how many of those we're going to keep. But we're a very large historical society. We do most of our exhibit work in-house, which is not super, that's basically a lot of really big institutions have jobs like mine in them. A lot of smaller museums will have people who do the same jobs, but they won't have the same title. So my job basically exists at very large and very well-funded museums. So, and just talk a little bit about how I got here, and then we can open it up to your questions. Is like, I have an academic PhD. I went to graduate school at the University of New Mexico. I got a PhD, and I was not planning on, planning on being an academic. And what happened is, after I finished all of my exams and everything, I moved from Albuquerque, which is where I went to grad school, to Denver, which is the city I was doing my research in. And, a place that I hadn't lived in tons of times before. And then a friend of mine from graduate school had just been hired as the new state historian of Colorado. And the Colorado Historical Society was tearing down its old museum, which was terrible, and building a new museum. And they actually so he was hiring people to do research for that project, and I needed money. And so I started working there. I started working on a 6-week project, and I ended up staying for 6 years, moving from like a content researcher to an actual staff researcher, meaning that I got like benefits, to the assistant state historian. And because my job was in exhibits, I was working in the exhibits department, I got basically trained on how to do exhibit work. So, my title is technically historian, and I did a lot of like research and talking to people and talking to the media, but I mostly did exhibits. And then, unfortunately, and this is extremely common in public history and in museums, we had a lot of funding issues. So my job in Colorado was, I guess, creatively funded, and they ran out of money. So I was trying to find another job, and I got the job here at NMHS and moved to Minnesota, which is a place I'd never really thought about living before. So, but again, like a lot of jobs in this field, you kind of have to go to where the jobs are. And, like, and I actually like living in the Twin Cities, but it's been hard adjusting to a new place. So anyway, but like when the reason I came up here was actually because we had much, like NMHS is much more stably funded. So we had money, I really wanted that kind of job security, which is really hard to get in museums. And so everything has been great. But this year, due to the pandemic, due to closing, we laid off 40% of our staff this year.
Wow.
And I got furloughed for 10 weeks and then brought back. But nobody has any idea what's happening after the end of this fiscal year. So, and we have a ton of museums that aren't opening at all this year. So the museum I'm working in is opening on October 1st after it closed on March 13th. So,
wow.
So anyway, so it's everything kind of, and that's across the museum field. Everything is kind of up in the air right now. Especially for people whose jobs depend on like earned revenue, on getting people in the door, paying admission, other things. If no one's coming in the door, you're not getting that money. So that's kind of a little bit about like what I do and how I got here. So anyway, so I think at this point, I'm happy to take questions.
That's
so
great.
Do you want to moderate the questions? How do we want to do this?
I can do whatever you're comfortable with. I think first, thank you. That's a great intro. I saw them all hurrying and taking notes. So I think you're going to get a lot of good questions. I wanted to ask real quick, would it be okay if I recorded this? We've got a couple of students that are emailing me. They're having trouble getting online and such. So would that be okay?
Totally fine.
Okay, thank you. And anybody else who is uncomfortable being on camera, being recorded, go ahead and you can black out your screen. That's okay. We like seeing your face, but I respect your privacy there too. So we've got a number of questions, and you can read them there or not. I know Zoe had her hand up real quick if we wanted to start there, and then we'll go from there.
Let me switch to a different view because I can't actually see everybody. So see if I can get everybody on screen. So it might be better. It might be better if I read questions from the chat, but if you can see everybody and can tell, like
that sounds like a deal. That sounds like a deal. Thanks, Erin. Okay, Zoe, why don't you go ahead?
Hi. So one of my questions, whenever I was reading that article about the New York Historical Society, and it seemed like they kind of had a blank slate area to choose what theme and what narrative to tell. And one of my questions was, and then it popped up again when I was exploring y'all's website for your historical society in Minnesota, because y'all have battlefields. So how do you kind of control the narrative for something like a battlefield or the Sixth Floor Museum here in Dallas when the history is already so it's less of a clean slate of like we can control what we tell them and more of it seems like it's more of we have to work within the bounds of what people already know. So I'm just wondering what kind of constraints come with a place where the theme is already built in.
So that's actually a really good question because I'll be honest, like my personal experience is mostly with state history museums where you're not interpreting a specific site, you're interpreting like a large geographic area. So, but I have worked on some stuff at Fort Snelling, which is our military history site at NMHS, which is also the most complicated historical site we have. And I could talk about Fort Snelling this whole time, so I don't really want to do that. But I was going to kind of say, first off, is that anytime that you're working on an exhibit, first off, you want to figure out what people already know about the thing that you're doing an exhibit on. Like, what are the things that we can assume people are coming in with? What are the things we assume that people don't know? And depending on the topic, that can be, like we did an exhibit at NMHS, which I didn't work on a couple of years ago for the 100th anniversary of American entry into World War I. And you can't assume people know a lot about World War I at all, especially like, why did we get in it? How does this war even make sense in any way? So we had the developers of that exhibit had to do a lot of kind of giving people enough background as they come through the thing to understand what it was like to live in the United States during World War I. So, and they did a lot of what we call visitor testing. We have like my museum has an evaluation department, and what we do a lot of times when we're doing exhibits is what we call formative evaluation, which is just a fancy way of saying like front end. We kind of try to figure out what visitors actually know, like especially like, you know, and we also want to know, are they actually going to come? That's actually just as important. And so we do a lot of things where we'll do like, and you can do it in a lot of different ways. You can do focus groups. You can talk to people who are already in the museum and ask them if they want to see some things about an upcoming project. People actually really love to get sneak peeks of projects in progress. Mm-hmm. Or you can do like the last exhibit I opened that did this. We did an online survey because we wanted to get people who weren't coming in the door. But, you know, figuring out what the frame people are coming in with is really, really important, because you hopefully are going to do an exhibit that challenges that frame. So for example, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about Fort Snelling without going in too much into the history of the place, but let's just say like everything bad in American history kind of like meets right there. So it's a sacred site to the Dakota people. And then it became a fur trade fort in the early 1800s. And then, God, like everything just happened there. It's also the place where Dred and Harriet Scott were enslaved. That's the part of, you know, Wisconsin territory that they were in, prompting their freedom suit. It's a place of Dakota genocide, because like when Minnesota extirpated the Dakota, it rounded all of the women and children and elders up and imprisoned them at the fort before sending them off to the Dakotas. It was also a Japanese internment site. It's a lot going on there. And right now the story, like, and it's for a long time, the entire interpretation was based on 1820, which is a time when nothing actually happened. It was safely outside of the danger zone of like, you know, like things that, you know, like our board and our leadership are kind of afraid to interpret. So it was this 1820s fort where you just learned about how people did laundry and how people did, like how soldiers drove, because like nothing, like literally this is for a long time, it's probably the most boring fort in the entire system for the actual like enlisted men. So, but that, so we know just, you know, from that narrative of like, either it was this great military fort, or the other story is that it was where most Minnesotans who fought in World War II mustered through Fort Snelling. It's either where the greatest generation left to go fight the war, or it's this military fort, and that's the story that people know about it. And so understanding what people are coming in with gives you the basis to like talk about how, you know, how to like push the story. So when you want to talk about slavery in Minnesota, which is again like is a northern state, you know, slavery is technically outlawed there. You can talk about the military, and you can talk about the fact that most of the officers stationed there are from the South, and a lot of officers are bringing their, you know, what they actually show up in records as personal servants, but are actually enslaved people up there, and talking about the fact that this was so isolated that no one really like was really paying attention to what was going on there. We can talk about, you know, for people who are really excited about World War II history, we can talk about the Japanese language school, that these are Nisei young men who are at internment camps who move here to learn Japanese to go, like, you know, basically support the United States war effort. So you want to know what people are coming in with and what kind of frames they have to first push that a little bit, but also kind of use what people have to steer them to new information. So that was very, like, that's like a really big question. So I hope that kind of answered that. But yeah, you know, a lot of places where people work already have an established story. So how do you tell that story, but also push people? And a lot of it is just kind of understanding what people want what's going to bring them in the door and like where they're at. So to figure out how you can push them. So
basically push them out of their comfort zone just until they're like, okay, I don't want to be here anymore. You gotta find that
and
spot.
I'll be honest, like, you know, like most people who are coming to history museums, you know, at least they're interested in history. Like, you know, I've kind of found in my own personal experience that there are, you know, you will get visitors who are very invested in like a particular narrative, like a settler narrative or like a patriotic narrative. And that's, we're getting a lot of pushback for Fort Snelling from people who are not, who never come to the site, by the way, but they're, you know, like, they're like, how are we not, why are we not telling the story of our patriotic Minnesotans? Even though it like literally like people, there's no military action ever at the fort. So we're getting a lot, we get a lot of that, but you know, most people who are actually paying admission and coming inside and encounter staff and talk to staff are fairly like, they're like, all right, you know, they may not incorporate it, but they're like, all right, you know, they're at least, we find that like people are at least kind of open. We don't know what they do with this afterwards. I mean, one of the frustrating things about this job is I have no idea what people are taking home with them. Are they learning anything? Are they just, you know, like, we have no way of tracking that. I mean, you can do surveys, but they're expensive. And it's, so I actually have no idea if anyone is actually getting anything out of anything I do. And that's very frustrating.
So there's no exit survey or anything like that?
We do them occasionally. Like we do, my museum does once a year, we do kind of a, well, we didn't this year for obvious reasons, but we do a general visitor survey where we do like an exit survey of people coming usually in July. And then we'll ask, you know, we'll ask like, what brought you here? What was your favorite? What did you get out of it? But that's, I mean, like that's encountering people maybe like, you know, they've been in the exhibits, maybe they went to the gift shop, they're on their way out. It's not 2 weeks later or
Right.
a month later. It's, you know, right where they're still in the building. So, so trying to think about that long-term impact is really, really hard. So,
That's
like,
good.
so we don't really have good ways to track, you know, knowledge over time.
That's good. I'm gonna, Cole Clark has asked in the chat, she's asked, what is the most fulfilling part of putting an exhibit together for you? In contrast, what is the most difficult part? And I think you partly answered that, but I wonder if you kind of, what's your favorite part of the most fulfilling part?
Oh, like, I think the part that's the most fulfilling is seeing people that you've, you know, like every exhibit I work with involves other people. Like, you know, we're always asking people to kind of share stuff with us, share their stories, work with us. And then when people see themselves in the exhibit for the first time, or they see the whole product, you know, people get really excited, and that's really, really, I know it's very satisfying to see other people seeing the exhibit for the first time. I mean, it's also exciting for me to see it for the first time, and it's a little different because, like, you know, when we're building an exhibit in our space, you know, you go down there every other day, it's like, oh, well, they've sort of painted that wall now. You know, you see that bit by bit by bit by bit, instead of people, you know, coming in and like, wow. Like, for example, like the last major exhibit that I worked on was an exhibit called First Avenue. Stories from Minnesota's Main Room, which is about an iconic Minneapolis music venue. And we worked with a ton of people who were like in the music industry here, people who worked at the venue, people who, like, you know, have been in bands. And, you know, we probably interviewed at least 200 people for this exhibit, you know, and for opening, we just invited them all into the space, and just seeing them, first off, see the space, and then realize, I mean, there's so many of them that know each other, like seeing people just kind of talk and point to things, and like people will be like taking pictures of themselves next to their picture in the exhibit. And like, it's just kind of really cool to see, like, be able to walk through something you created and see other people react to it and get really excited that this thing is here, and then like talk to their friends, and like, you know, realizing that you actually have a really strong impact on people's lives is really the best part of putting an exhibit together. I mean, some of the most difficult parts are, um, actually, the single hardest part is actually figuring out what the exhibit is about. And, and that sounds simple, but it isn't. And I think it's figuring out the message of each exhibit. And because like you want each exhibit to have one kind of big idea, main message, and coming up with what that is can be the hardest part. It can actually take a long time because you have all of this information, and depending on the topic, you're like, this is awesome and this is awesome, and I want people to know about this, and I want people to know about this, and want people to know about this. But knowing that you have to boil that down to here's something that people are going to get, and then figuring out what gets put in and what gets left out. Because there's always stuff that I love that I want to put in exhibits, and then I realize, or mostly the rest of my team is like, no, only you're interested in that.
Right. So what I'm hearing from you is that you have a thesis statement or
yes.
a main argument to every exhibit, and then that by having that thesis statement or argument, that's how you weed things out, just like you would from a paper or a book or anything else, only it's a physical thing.
Absolutely. Because like it's, and I mentioned this a little bit in the comic that, here's the thing is like, again, people come to exhibits for a lot of different reasons. We like to think people are coming to like learn amazing things, but people are coming to exhibits because they're inside, which is a big issue for us in Minnesota in the winter. People are just like, I'm just going to go where it's warm, and I don't really care what's going on in there. People come for a social experience. People come because, like the whole family is in town, and we need something that will amuse both 5-year-olds and 65-year-olds. And a lot of times the history museum is that thing. So people come for a lot of reasons, and just think about the way that you encounter an exhibit. Like you're standing up, you're probably with some people. You're not sitting down and reading a book, you're standing, you're talking, you're processing information. So, I think there's like, I don't have the exact, but I think there's been studies of visitors that show that visitors read maybe 25% of the words in an exhibit anyway, and there's not that many things in there. So you want to make sure that there's like, we want people to get X out of this, and everything is built around that. So for example, for the First Avenue exhibit, we knew first off from testing, because we did a lot of testing around this and we did a lot of surveys, that most of the people who were going to come see that exhibit already knew a lot about the Minneapolis music scene. Like they'd gone to shows there, so we didn't have to tell them a lot about music history, but we wanted to talk about this place and what it meant to different types of people. What's it like to work there? What's it like to go to what's it like to be a performer on stage? What's it like to be a fan? Because we had a mix of those people were the audience for that. So anyway, so the idea basically boiled down to, First Avenue is a really, really important place. It's a very meaningful place to a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. And that actually, if you wrote that in a paper, that would not be a very good thesis statement. But it's actually pretty good for an exhibit. So because at the end, the whole point of the exhibit was to get people to reflect on what that place meant to them. And so the end is like this wall of like stories that people left. Talking about like, hey, what's your best story about going to this place?
Wow.
So we're kind of setting that up for that end where we're asking people to share. So once we got the fact that, we're talking about what this place meant to specific groups of people, that helped us figure out like, all right, well, if we're talking about staff, what do we need to talk about? Well, we want to talk about behind the scenes things. We want to talk about the kind of, what's it like to book a show? What's it like to be in the manager's office? Once we knew we wanted to talk about, the experience of performers and what this place did to their career, we knew we could probably tell the story of like maybe 4 or 5 performers very well. We didn't have to have everybody's favorite band in there. So we also just had a blank wall where you could write your name of your favorite band on a chalkboard. So once we kind of got that idea, it helped us get rid of a lot of stuff. and focus not necessarily on the like, let's talk about the shift from 8 tracks to CDs to, which is like stuff that people like said, like, maybe we should talk about this. We should talk about like, like what is, like, how do we put this in the context of people's lives living in the Twin Cities? So it really, really, like, that's why it's so important to do. And it's so that, like once you figure out that theme or big idea or that thesis, you can figure out the themes that you want in the exhibit. And then what stories and objects and other things are we going to use to illustrate those themes? And it kind of goes from there. And it also helps because, like, again, like people just, exhibits are free choice environments and people do what they want in them. So somebody might come to an exhibit, read like the first part, and then wander around a bit and maybe read something in the back, and then leave. So, or somebody comes in and watches all the videos. And you just want to make sure if you have that idea, you can layer it throughout the entire exhibit. So that, I mean, like, it's totally okay to just go in and do what you want. So, but we just want to make sure that that information is getting through to, like, visitors of all different kind of engagement levels. So
that is very cool. I'm going to ask a personal question. Did Prince play there?
Yes.
Oh.
So it is not just where Prince played there, it is where Purple Rain was filmed. So
I wondered if that was where it was. Oh my gosh.
So,
as a Gen Xer, that's a very big deal to me, and I'm going to have to come and see it.
So I actually just like that actually can, like, it's actually really important to know that, because that's why this, we actually spent a lot of time negotiating with the Prince estate for footage and name and image rights. So, so like that's actually like what we spent a lot of money on this exhibit, and we spent a lot of money on, not just like footage and other things, but like negotiating with the Prince estate was a big part of it. And we also have in our, it's probably the most popular thing we have in our collections is the purple outfit from Purple Rain. And so we have one of those, and we basically built a section of the exhibit around it. It was the one thing we knew going in that we wanted to put on display, is that outfit. So because people come, no matter what story we're telling, if that's on display, people will come see it.
Yeah, I would think so. That's very cool. Well, good. I think Scarlett had her hand up from the pretty early on. Did you have a question, Scarlett?
I did, and I've only gotten more questions, but I'll try not to take up too much time.
Okay.
Well, because I was looking at y'all's website, and you have the Votes for Women exhibit, which I loved. I thought it was very cool. And I was like, especially because in your comic, you kind of talk about the multimodality of exhibits. And I was wondering just like how important that physical space is and how you kind of translate that multimodality into an online space. And then this is my second part that I'm getting in there while I have the floor. If you think that there is more interest in, I guess, diverse interpretations as this field is kind of growing, and just sort of like if there has been a shift in audiences and what they expect, like, I don't know, as long as you've been in this field.
Well, I will answer, those are both excellent questions, and I can definitely answer the votes. I can definitely answer both, but just the quick thing about the Votes for Women website and exhibit. So first off, if you went to our website and you saw kind of the Votes for Women online exhibit, that is totally a product of the pandemic. So so we've been planning this, and
I thought it was great, honestly.
It's really good. I'm not working on that project, but I do know a lot about it because I've been around it. That is an exhibit that we were putting together for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And it was supposed to open at the History Center, I think about a week ago. If everything had gone, if 2020 had gone like we thought it might, it would have opened. And there was a little bit, I mean, we do kind of a web presence for every exhibit, but it's mostly intended to drive attendance. It's not kind of an online learning resource. It's more like, this is what we have, this is when it's open, here's some things you'll see in it. depending on what type of exhibit it is, like here's some other online resources we have. But when we realized that we were not going to be able to open Votes for Women in September, what happens is that, I mean, for a lot of museums right after, because most museums obviously close for at least some time part of this year. And for a lot of museums, there's like this online, like, how do we shift to digital really quick? Like, how do we put together, like, how do we promote our existing digital resources? How do we build new digital resources? How do we shift our programming to like doing like Zoom programming, things like that? And so we kind of figured, especially with the election coming up, that we would do, we take what the team ended up taking most of the content I put together for the Votes for Women exhibit and turning it into that website. So there's not yet an actual physical exhibit, but there will be in March, which is when, after all of the layoffs and all of the changes, that's as early as we can actually get something open. It's going to be a much smaller version of the original exhibit, which was originally about 7,000 square feet, and that's a very sizable exhibit. It's going to be smaller, and because there's already a web presence that has all these biographies of activists and other people, we're going to really focus on, like, first off, like the 3D objects that we have, because we have some really, really great objects. And we're going to talk a lot about, you know, kind of, I don't know, it's like, you know, like, we're going to try to talk a little bit about process and how we put this exhibit together. And then what are the kind of interesting things that we found researching all of these women? I keep saying we, but they didn't work on it. But, you know, like having something that's more of a, you know, just talks about the objects. It's more about kind of the process of like, here's something really great that we found out about all of these different women. And then there'll be some sort of talk back at the end, but we're waiting until after the election to figure out what that is. So, because there's, again, when you're talking about voting and talking about democracy, and right now, like so we're not quite sure what the end of that is. So, but usually, again, like we prioritize the physical exhibit because that's what drives attendance and that's what drives revenue. But with people not coming in and all of this information that we already gathered, you know, we are shifting to doing more digital exhibits. So that's the answer to your first question. And the second one about diverse interpretation is that there's, trying to think of a good way to talk about this. Yes, we are interested in more diverse interpretation is the short version. But museums have a real whiteness problem in a lot of different ways. So first off, there's the fact that most museum staffs are heavily white. Our visitors, depending on the museum, this changes. But my museum, like the one group that we get in without any like effort whatsoever, is older, well-educated, white Twin Cities residents. Like those are the people who will come. It doesn't really matter what we have. They will come in the door, they go to lectures, and they go to everything. So so that's, for a long time, that has been the community that we have really like focused our outreach and our interpretation on. And, you know, in the field, especially over the last 10 years, there's been a lot more focus on, you know, not just like, hey, well, how are we telling these stories, but like, how do we help other people tell their own stories in our space? How do we do things how do we co-create with communities? How do we, you know, make sure that no matter what the topic is, we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about ethnicity. How do we make sure that we're doing all of those things? And it's like, at least with my museum, we're making a good effort, but it's still not a lot. I mean, again, when we laid off a bunch of people, we ended up laying off a lot of our diverse staff. So how does that affect our interpretation in the future? All of our curators are white, except one that we just hired a year ago. All of our exhibit developers are white. How do we, you know, like, how do we actually do the work? You know, you know, like, how do we actually transform the institution to make that kind of work the default rather than like something that's a special extra bonus? Like, we have to, like, our normal process produces this, but we have to create this new process to produce this. How do we make the new process the default is something that we're, thinking about a lot. So, yeah, and it's like, I mean, if museums don't diversify, like, they're gonna die. So, like, it's kind of, it's not, should we do it? It's like, why aren't we doing that now?
Right. I'm curious if you all were collecting anything during the Black Lives Matter protests and such that were going on there in Minneapolis.
So that's a really good question. And it's actually what I'm working on right now. So we have actually had kind of an ongoing contemporary collecting initiative called History Is Now. And we've kind of, I'm not in collections, so I'm not super part of this, but it's kind of when there's things going on that curators are particularly interested in getting, like specific, mostly photographs, but also some like 3D objects and oral histories about, we'll do kind of a History Is Now project. And we've done a few of them in the past. The only one that they've done since I started working there before this year was when Prince died. They did a huge photography, like asked for like people's photographs and people's memories, and we got a lot of stuff from all of the memorials that are around the Twin Cities. So this year, like, we have two overlapping ones. We have the COVID-19 one, which we started in April, and then we are just starting one about kind of the murder of George Floyd, racial unrest, and the uprising. And we're getting a late start for actually some very specific reasons. And one of them is that there's a lot of institutions in the Twin Cities that are interested in this stuff and are like, we specifically hired a curator to do outreach to kind of historically excluded groups, specifically the African American community. And she was like, we need to give African American, like there's a African American museum, there's a couple of kind of heritage initiatives, give them first crack at everything before we step in. So just kind of to give you a sense, like, we are kind of the big elephant in the room in kind of the Minnesota history field. We kind of do a lot of stuff without thinking a lot about who it's going to affect. We do a lot of stuff that actually has a negative impact on other smaller institutions. I mean, we have first off, we have like an almost $100 million budget per year. And like, we're competing with all of these other institutions that maybe have like a $750,000 budget per year. So we have done a lot of work in the last couple of years to really think about our position in the community and try to think about how we can help other institutions just as much as our own. So so after the murder, we reached out to a couple of these other smaller institutions and offered our kind of support, some of that is just technical support, like, hey, you need, something's coming in and you don't have, like, say, the kind of the freezer, because everything that comes in the door, we like put in a freezer so that, it can actually decontaminate it, make sure it doesn't have things in it. We have really extensive facilities for that, more than most museums. So we're offering like our freezers and other things. But we were building those relationships so that these other places got first choice of what was going on. So that's why we're starting our initiative now, because, and we also know that we have a reach that a lot of places don't do. So this is actually, we're starting this initiative in collaboration with these other institutions. And what I'm working on is an exhibit that's about that, but we don't know what that means yet, because to be honest, we've mostly collected oral histories. And we have a lot of oral histories of COVID, and a lot of those are basically, I miss going to restaurants, and I miss going to restaurants too. But it's not like, you're like, what do we do with that? So,
Right.
so right now we're trying to figure out, like, in spring, like, what is a space that what can a space do that's talking about both, like the pandemic, it's talking about the uprising, and talking about God knows what else might happen between now and March.
Mm-hmm.
And does it in a way, because we don't think people are actually going to want to come to the History Center to learn about these things. People are immersed in this. There's too much information already. People are just like bathing in information right now. So we're trying to figure out how we talk about these things in a way that provides either like some kind of way to kind of reflect on what has happened over the last year, or provides ways for like families to, like, there's multi-generational conversations about what's going on, or allows you to kind of connect with another person. So like I think we all miss talking to people right now. So we're trying to think about how to do that. And like we're trying to make it not an exhibit because I mean, like, nobody wants to come in and see a lot of masks.
Right.
I mean, they're just trying to think, like, they're like, I got one of those on my face.
But if we survive, maybe 100 years ago, from now they will, right?
That's the thing. I mean, we're collecting that stuff, but how do you interpret something in the present in a way that's relevant to people?
Right.
Is what we're really trying to
put it in a box, right?
Yeah. Or just like, we're trying to think about, do we just have artists like interpret what's happened last year?
Right.
So that's what I'm doing that.
That's good. So Wanda Lise had a comment, and then Hunter, I see your hand. I know it's been up for a while. So Wanda Lise asked about if exhibit swaps are a thing between the museums from different regions, cultures, and demographics, and is that a way to exchange the different voices and staff contributions? So I think that kind of relates to what you're saying, but do you ever share your materials with some of those other museums?
Oh yeah, we do share. We share in a couple of different ways. And again, each museum is different, but this is how we do things. First off, we do actually develop our own exhibits that travel around the state. So a lot of our outreach is to other museums in Minnesota, because that's, like, that's who we're actually, like, we're legally like bound to serve the state people of the state of Minnesota. So we have a lot of, like, usually if we do a big exhibit at the History Center, we'll do smaller traveling versions that will go around the state. But we also do a lot of collaborations with other museums, especially we're not doing this as much now because of changes in the field and things like that. But for most of, like, up until probably about like maybe a couple years ago, we were doing these large national traveling exhibits that were all collaborations between us and other museums. Like we did one called the 1968 exhibit, which is about 1968. And it was a collaboration between us, the Chicago History Museum, which had a lot of 1968 Democratic National Convention materials, the Atlanta History Center, which had a lot of civil rights. Going to be leaving a couple. The Oakland Museum in Oakland Museum of California in Oakland, and there's one other that I'm forgetting, but basically we all pooled our collections together and kind of our expertise, and basically it made all of those like museums together were able to get like a bunch of grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and other grantors, and so we were able to, like, again, like this is before I got there, but people were able to kind of like pool our resources in ways that we would never been able to do on our own. So we also lend things out all the time, and we also borrow things all the time. So we're always like, if you're in our collections department, you're always kind of in dialogue with other museums about things that they might want. And then when I'm putting together an exhibit, we're always looking for things in other museums that we can borrow. And usually we're actually getting things from like local museums because of the stories that we tell. But for example, for the First Avenue exhibit, we did a bunch of museum loans from the Museum of Popular Culture in Seattle, which had a huge kind of grunge and alternative music collection. And I felt really old browsing through it. And so, but we also like one of my jobs that I do occasionally is we also have a thing that we call field services. So we actually have kind of an in-house training department for other museums. So basically what we do is we offer like training modules to like smaller museums, and those are almost all in the state, but we do also do outreach to like Iowa and the Dakotas and things like that. But we offer kind of like grant writing help, help with labels. Like, so I occasionally will go and teach label writing workshops around the state. And it's kind of, it's actually probably one of our most successful programs, is actually the part where we go out and help other museums. So, so we have this weird situation where all the little tiny museums around the state love us, but every other museum in the Twin Cities hates us. So, so anyway, so yeah, so that's, but I mean, like, we don't do like swaps like that, but we are in conversation with other museums a lot, you know, and a lot of what I do is learning from other museums. So, so like we always go on, if we can afford it, and obviously we're not doing this now, but we go on inspiration visits to other museums. We're always interested in what other people are doing. Like, we're always learning from other, you know, like, museums aren't competing with each other really. I mean, they are in some ways, like they're competing for donors, but we're not competing for, oh, you did an exhibit on this, so we can't do it. You know, because every museum is different. Every audience is slightly different. So.
Very cool. Thank you. Hunter, why don't you go ahead and get your question in?
Sure. And no surprise, but I have a couple, but I don't want to take the floor forever. So I'm just going to do like one at a time.
All
and
right.
You can come back to me later, Dr. Landick. I'll just put my hand back up.
Okay.
So for reference, Dr. Cole, we had read about Rabinowitz's Slavery in New York exhibit from the early 2000s. That was kind of what a lot of our reading focused on. So my questions are kind of geared around those readings. So one of them talked about how that exhibit kind of exemplified the idea that curatorial work, I don't say that word out loud that often, leads not only to exhibits, but can also provide new knowledge that hasn't been there before. And I thought that was like a really interesting idea or concept, because I've always, you know, kind of subconsciously pictured museums as presenters of knowledge, not really as creators of knowledge. And I was just wondering if in your own experience, if you've ever had like a big moment, like a eureka moment, where you guys find something like new that hasn't like been existent or shared in that way before, or taken a topic and put it in a new spin and presented it in a new way that hasn't been done before. I'm just wondering if you had any moments like that.
Oh yeah, like, you know, especially like I tend to do exhibits that are more about contemporary issues, and by contemporary I mean it kind of in a way that historians think about contemporary, which is basically from like the 60s to the present. So a lot of times we're doing exhibits on things where it isn't like there's like a book we can go talk, we can go refer to. Like, we always have to do our own research, because even if there are like, you know, like for example, for this World War I exhibit that we did, there's so many things written about World War I, but that doesn't mean that told us anything about the objects we had in our own collection. So it gave us kind of a big national framework, but it didn't, like, why do we have this nurse's uniform? Why do we have this? Why do we have this? So almost every exhibit I've done has involved original research in some ways. And sometimes it's, you know, like the fact that we're actually like going out interviewing people who haven't been interviewed before, or you know, like we're always bringing together collections of things that hadn't been seen before. And so a lot of things you will see in museums is like original research by the staff. I mean, it's not really credited to people. You may not realize it because it's not footnoted, but very few exhibits are just like, oh, here's this, we're just going to present this. Unless it's a traveling exhibit coming from other museum or something like that. But if it's something that museum is generating in-house, they've had to do their own research for it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very good. Ron, do you have a question?
Yes. So I wanted to go back. So I liked one of Scarlett's questions about the inclusivity part of it. And so you had mentioned that a lot of the staff is white, a lot of the, the guests are white as well. But then earlier on, you had mentioned, I forgot what battle that was that you had talked about, but whatever that battle was, you had mentioned how, I guess prior it was more whitewashed, and now, it's start, peeling away at, looking at, the story of enslaved people or indigenous people as well, or well, both. So, now that, their pasts are getting included. And also on the website, it talked about one of the exhibits was Our Home Native Minnesota. And I looked at that one a little bit, and on one of the videos, it said, one of the people that were doing the video was said, it's telling it from a native perspective to dispel some stereotypes. So like, are these like new ways of looking at it that you all are doing? Is that kind of helping, I guess, attract a more inclusive or more diverse audience? By chance, I mean, are you starting to notice like that rather than having the same sort of white people in your museum?
Yeah. So, I mean, so again, even though like a lot of museums are a very kind of white settler, institution, we have actually, we can't tell, like, we have to create relationships with other groups of people in order to tell their stories. So Fort Snelling, which is the place I was mentioning before, we are actually in the process of reinterpreting that, and we've actually been working with a lot of community advisory groups. We have a specific, we have a Dakota Advisory Council, we have a Ojibwe Advisory Council, we have also just a kind of a pan kind of indigenous advisory council that's been helping us with that project. We've done a lot of outreach to kind of African American communities in the Twin Cities to try to figure out, like, not just do we, like, how do we talk about Dred Scott, but how do we talk about kind of the experience of being Black in Minnesota? When the most famous, there's like, I think there's something like the most famous Black person in Minnesota was enslaved and then moved somewhere else. And then we had to wait, and then there was Prince. How do you talk about your experience about everyday life and dealing with racism and all of these things when people are just focused on these two, like all of these individual people? So we've actually, what we've done is, you kind of notice this with Our Home exhibit, is we do something that's kind of not, it works to kind of diversify our audiences and diversify our staff, but it's not a long-term solution, is that we do basically kind of something like serial dating, where we'll focus on a community for a certain period of time. Like my first project when I got to NMHS was to do an exhibit about kind of Indian American communities in the Twin Cities. And we got in a traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian called Beyond Bollywood, which we used as kind of a framework for our much larger exhibit about Indian Americans in the Twin Cities. So we did a lot of community work, a lot of outreach. We already had an established relationship with a lot of the community organizations. So it wasn't like we just started. We were actually building on 20 years of collaboration that we already had. It was one of our most successful community collaborations, but it's like for about a year and a half, like these are the festivals that we're going to, these are the programs that we're having. And and we very much we had a lot of Indian American families attending. But then once the exhibit was over, it was almost like the relationship was over. And unless I still went to like a lot of community events because I made friends in the community and things like that. But the focus of NMHS went to a different group. We started to do stuff about like the Somali community in Minnesota, and we just started that cycle over and over again. So we are trying very hard not to do there's nothing wrong with doing exhibits that are about specific communities, because you can do stuff in depth that you can't necessarily do in a more kind of general exhibit. But how do you keep those relationships going is the problem. We've done really good kind of African American history projects in the past, but then we dropped the relationship after that, and so people don't want to work with us because they're just like, you only call when you want something from me. So to talk a little bit about Our Home, and this kind of does tie this together, is like a couple of years ago, we established a Native American Initiatives Department. So we have a specific department for Native American outreach. All the staff are Native, I think mostly Dakota with a few Ojibwe people. So those are the two main kind of tribal nations of what we now know as Minnesota. And it's a dedicated department. They do basically they coordinate all of our Native American outreach. And it's the staff of that department that actually put together our home exhibit in collaboration with the exhibits department. So because this is a permanent, at least as permanent as anything can be in museums, it's a permanent department with like staff who are not on random grants or anything like that. It's it's dedicated hiring and dedicated community outreach that's leading to that. So I would say in the time that I've been here, our relationship with Native groups has gotten a little better, and that's because we've deliberately, sought people out, built relationships, and then hired people, not just for projects or bringing in interns or anything, but here we're going to create like an actual like senior vice president level person for Indigenous outreach. So that's kind of how it's part of a much larger process. So we definitely do have a department of inclusion and community engagement that used to be big, and then it retreated a little bit, and then we laid off a bunch of people, and now we're trying to rebuild it again. And nobody, and nothing hurts your relationships with communities more than promising something and doing something awesome and then laying off everybody who worked on that, because then nobody wants to work with you ever again.
Right. Now, Erin, I asked you for an hour, and you've given us an hour now, but do you mind giving us a little bit longer for a few more questions?
I can answer a few more questions.
Oh, thank you. So one of the things that we've been doing, last week, we talked to Lacey LeBlue, who is the curator at the Pioneer Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. It's a nice sized museum, a series of historic homes and things like that. Obviously very small compared to yours. They're a much more limited budget. They've only got 4 full-time staff, that kind of thing. And one of the things we talked with her was the importance of fundraising, keeping those stakeholders happy. And so that idea of both, how do you get your money, that big $100 million budget. Can you guys imagine Lacey's eyes if somebody said they'd give her $100 million, right? And then Hildred has asked, related to some of the readings that they did today, is how that outreach or the work you're doing is impacted by the stakeholders, both inside and outside the museum, and including donors and things like that. Can you kind of touch on some of those?
Absolutely. And those are really important questions. The question of where does the money come from is something that basically every public historian has to worry about, where their money is coming from. And so I'll be honest, I cannot give you up-to-date figures right now, but I can say before the pandemic, because we really have no idea what our budget picture is right now. We got 70% of our funding from the Minnesota legislature. We are not a state agency. We are a private nonprofit funded by the state of Minnesota, whatever that means. I still don't really know. And then we get the rest of the funding comes from earned revenue, which is, it's admissions, it's gift shop sales, it's parking, because we charge a lot for parking. It's, other things that we charge fees for. And then kind of a mix of grants, our endowment, donors, and then we have something that's called the Legacy Fund in Minnesota, which is basically a sales tax that funds arts. It funds a whole lot of things, but for our purposes, it funds arts organizations like us. So that means that the largest stakeholder in our work is the Minnesota State Legislature. And we are starting to bump into more and more issues with the state legislature. And right now, a lot of the work that we've been doing, not mine so much, but other prominent projects, have been really our leadership is very risk adverse and is trying to not annoy the state legislature. So Minnesota has, I think, the only split legislature in the country. I mean, we have a Democratic governor, Democratic House, and we have a Republican Senate. And the Senate controls the budget. And there's quite a few people, state senators in the state Senate who are very unhappy with, specifically, I'm glad that we started with Fort Snelling, because I don't have to explain to you our redo of Fort Snelling. that, you know, like when we talk about people unhappy, that we're not talking about patriotism and our military people. It's not actually our visitors, it's the state legislature. It's people who are kind of using like what they perceive as, you know, like, oh, we're not talking about our enlisted men and women anymore, which is not true at all. But we're talking about Dakota people or enslaved people or all of these other things. We're not talking about X. So a couple of years ago, we renamed the site of Fort Snelling to be Historic Fort Snelling at Bdote. So Bdote is the site that it's on. It's Bdote is the area at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, and it's a sacred origin site for some bands of Dakota people. And so that's actually the name of the area, is Bdote, not Fort Snelling. So we wanted to honor, you know, part of this, you know, part of the relationship, improving the relationship with Indigenous Minnesotans is like recognizing that, you know, we need to rename some things, we need to include other things. So we changed the name to Historic Fort Snelling at Bdote. And we thought we could do that because it's our site, and the state legislature basically threatened to take away 20% of our funding unless we went back to Historic Fort Snelling. And wow. Our leadership basically caved and said, sure. So, and so I was working on that project, but I'm not anymore. But everything that goes on there, there's people in the state legislature that are very concerned about this. And the way that the budget cycle works in Minnesota, we get our money authorized like every other year. So we have to continually keep saying, here's what we're doing, here's how we're fulfilling these needs, here's how we're talking about American history. Like, you know, like at this point, we're getting a lot more, in the last couple of years, a lot more pushback from the legislature than we ever have before. And, you know, like we did a author talk with, I can't remember the name, the historian, but he was talking about the myth of the Christian nation, and that got, you know, that got called out right on the floor of the state Senate. And so we're dealing with a really politicized climate, like everybody is right now, but we've almost never had that before. It was just like this automatic, like, here's your money. But it's kind of both, you know, a reaction to what we're doing, and also just a reaction to kind of the larger political climate in Minnesota. So in contrast, most of our donors are just like, here, just do something with this money. We don't actually have that many, like we get, I mean, part of it is we get a lot of corporate foundation money, and corporate foundations are fairly kind of apolitical. I mean, they're not, like, nothing is really non-political, but you know, they're mostly just like, you know, we're getting money from like Target and like 3M, and you know, like that's, you know, like the big corporations in Minnesota are like medical and computer, and it's like, and then Target. So that's who we're dealing with. You know, not people who are doing things that are super controversial. And then we have, like, you know, we'll have donors for specific projects, and you know, hopefully, and like I've had issues with our donor, not the donors specifically, but the our development office, because we have a specific group of fundraisers, and my big issue is that they will promise things to donors that I can't deliver and don't want to deliver. And I'm, you know, like my big fight is trying to keep the development office from, I don't want to say selling, but it might as well just say it's selling exhibit content to donors. We've kind of we've got them to stop doing that, but for a while they're just like, oh yeah, we can totally have a panel about you in the exhibit. I'm like, no, you can't. So every group of donors, I mean, like, to be honest, like it's our legislative money that's causing us the most problems right now, and it's the stuff that's we consider to be kind of our most fragile source of funding, which is a problem because it's most of it. But anytime that you're, you know, like the problem is that like all of our donors are kind of like, you know, like they basically represent the status quo. You know, there's not a lot of money for going out, you know, like there's not a lot of corporate money for going out and doing new things, or at least new things we want to do. Like if we wanted to do something like, hey, can you tie history more into like STEM education? You know, like there's a lot of money for that, but can you have more money to hire a more diverse staff? Like there's not that much money for that. So even non-problematic donors still kind of reinforce the status quo. So
that's very interesting that they literally threaten to take 20% of your budget away just for you being more accurate in the name of the place. I mean, that's,
I think it was 20%. It was like 15, or it was enough
a
that
big
people
chunk.
were absolutely like we had to have lots of staff meetings about this.
Yeah. Wow, that's really disappointing. I think Hunter has his hand up again. Hunter, do you have another question?
Yeah, I have two more on the docket for the night, or this one and then one more on the docket for tonight. So again, it has to do with the readings because I find those really fascinating. So in one of our readings, Rabinowitz kind of classifies his immersion media, his like panels and the way that he's presenting his information. He classifies them in two different ways. He does one as an overview and one as an immersion media. And so I was wondering, in your experience, like do you have any particularly powerful like immersion media that you recall? Because it seemed to me like that was the one that offered most creativity. Kind of like in his presentation, they had the well where people could come and listen to the voices of, these actresses playing slave characters. And that seems to be like where I think you can get a lot of creativity and have like a really powerful kind of immersion experience. And so I was wondering, are there any like that you have seen either as like a audience member or as a curator where you're like, oh, that's really, really cool,
So we do actually have quite a few of those in our museum. And one of the things that we can do with our budget is we have a full media department, which is not normal for a history museum, but we do have a lot of what we call, like there's a lot of different words. We use the term object theater, which is kind of a term of art of where like you go in, like visitors go into a place that's kind of basically into a kind of theatrical set, and then they're kind of immersed in a story that sometimes we use our collections to tell. And things like that. So we have some of them. So for example, for the First Avenue exhibit, like that you want, like we had so much to draw on from stage footage and photographs and things like that. So we have basically a replica of the stage that you come in and it's like you're seeing a show and you hear people talking and somebody starts talking about the first time they played on the stage and what it meant to them. And then the curtain raises and then it's like an 8 or 9 minute presentation about like we're telling the history of this place through like people saying like either like, hey, I threw up in all of these bathrooms, or people talking about when the venue closed for a little bit due to some tax issues, like what was it like to close the doors and realize that you might never come in the door again, like. So wow. Especially for something like this topic, like you want especially like one of the things we really struggle with is like, you're talking about basically, it's an exhibit about an ephemeral experience. Like, you're coming in, you see your friends, you want to, like, how do you kind of create that kind of excitement, create that kind of immersion in a space, especially when it's a place that people can just like drive 15 minutes away and go to, and they have beer and
yeah. In that specific example, the First Avenue exhibit, that sounds super similar to the well that they mentioned in the article. Are those like words that you guys use, those speeches that you guys use, were those hired actors that you hired out and like scripts written, or was that like taken from oral history that you had like interviewed people about that site?
So for First Avenue, I've actually worked on both of those types of things. So for First Avenue, since we're dealing with living people, we just did interviews with a bunch of people. So, and we did a lot of oral histories for the exhibit. And then we went back and re-interviewed a lot of people and asked them much more focused questions specifically for use in that, because people mumble a lot.
Yeah.
so that's you know, like those are, and we use like the actual images because these are people who would already be familiar to a lot of people coming in the door. At my old museum, History Colorado, we did what we called a Dust Bowl theater, where we tried to recreate the worst dust storm of the Dust Bowl in Colorado. And we built that, and when we built it, we kind of realized that almost everybody who actually lived through that storm that was still living was like 2 or 3 when the storm actually happened. So what we ended up doing was going through and finding all the oral histories we could, because fortunately there are actually quite a few that people did, both in Colorado, and again, because we're talking about right on the border, we got a lot from Oklahoma and others. And what we did is we went through and we developed a script out of them. And we just kind of took people through the experience of like, it's a beautiful day, but obviously you see these clouds on the horizon, and then the windstorm starts, and then talking about what it's like to actually go through that with like, you know, static electricity and all these things. And so we scripted it, and then we had to figure out and we cast voice actors to do the actual voices. And we had to figure out, because again, like we have a script, we know like this is from the oral history of X person, but our visitors are not going to know that. How do we combine, you know, like how do we combine things where people are going to be like, we don't want to have like 75 different voices because people aren't going to be able to follow that. So I think we boiled it down to about 4 women and 3 men, and combined a couple of people. But then the credits, we actually kind of gave, you know, like here's all the sources that we're using and things like that. And so we ended up doing like voice casting and recording, but we also did a script for First Avenue because, and it wasn't necessarily a script because we were basically, you know, we're not telling people, can you say this? But, you know, because we'd already interviewed them, we knew what their story was.
Yeah.
But we like, how do we make things
directing
flow?
the question? Yeah. That's really cool that you have those examples are so similar to the well example that we read in our reading, which I thought sounded amazing. So that's really cool to me that you have like that you've done stuff so similar to that. I would love to see an exhibit like that. I've been to museums, but I've never been in one that was that interactive where you have like voices around you recreating like oral history. Like that sounds awesome to me.
We are kind of getting into a point where like that's causing a problem for us, because now we're figuring out as we reopen, how do we have a lot of buttons for people to push. We have a lot of places where we ask people to stand close to each other to kind of hear these things. So we're doing a lot to figure out how to make those phrases immersive, but still make them like
in our time
or at least people like, I don't know if it's hygiene theater or not, but at least you know, we want to do the best we can to protect our visitors as they come in the door.
That's great. Zoe, you have your question.
Okay, mine is super related to hunters. So I noticed I was a theater kid all through middle school and high school. And so the part where, I can't say his last name, Rabinowitz, the part where he was like, we're acting almost as, you know, theater directors and setting a stage and everything. We're taking this history and we're dramatizing it. My question is, how do you juggle that drama of making the history intriguing to people, but then also making it truthful? And we kind of talked about that last week, or not last week, 2 weeks ago with Lacey gosh, I'm messing up all my words.
Right.
And so I was wondering, how do you do that in like a museum exhibit situation, especially considering all of your stakeholders and everything? Just that juggle between drama and truth.
Well, first off, I mean, a lot of times the truth is actually pretty dramatic. So, like, you know, basically a lot of it comes down to what we value. And, you know, I can't speak for other people's projects, but on mine, like, you know, I want people to be engaged. I want people to kind of be interested and immersed in the story, but I don't want it to come at the kind of the expense of like, here's what's, you know, of like actually not telling the truth. So, and that's why, you know, when you come up with like, here's the idea that this is about, like, and, you know, encapsulating that is like, this is the version of the story we're going to be telling, or the versions of the story we're going to be telling if you have a lot of different voices in it. But, you know, I mean, like, we don't, we actually don't run into this very often because, again, like we know that we're a history museum. You know, our our biggest problem is not being able to put everything in, not so much how do we, like, are we telling something that's accurate? It's more like, like if people are only going to be in the exhibit for a little bit, what version of of the truth do we like emphasize the most? And to be honest, I mean, a lot of it is that we don't do a lot of these kind of theater pieces with things that aren't fairly dramatic to begin with. I mean, like this is the thing is that like there's good ways to tell every story. Like for example, we would never do an object theater about like a city council meeting or, but like, for like a huge dust storm, something that is it's not just like it's something you think about, but it's also an emotional and physical experience. Like that's something where you can actually add to people's kind of knowledge of what the Great Depression was like in Colorado. Again, like with First Avenue, I mean, like, you're like, you want to see like awesome people on stage, and that like the object theater is about like, here's all of the different stories people have about this place. So like in some ways we're not going to use that technique for something that isn't already pretty dramatic, that doesn't already have compelling material. Like for example, another object theater we have in our museum is one, it's I haven't been in it for a while, but it's the voice of two Minnesota soldiers who were at the invasion of Normandy and D-Day, and it's from like their oral histories of one guy was the only guy from his unit to survive and just what that was like. And that is also like, that's, if you think about you're in a plane, like his oral history has this really like kind of amazing description of what it was like to be in the plane, waiting to land, like hearing like the other soldiers in the place like crying or getting sick to their stomachs, and then at the end you learn this guy was the only person from his unit to survive. Like that's kind of the material that you want to dramatize. So, and I'll just to talk a little bit about the theater connection. We actually hire a lot of people out of theater, especially for like lighting, and our exhibit designer right now is also a theater designer. We have a lot, especially not necessarily in our interpretive department, but our like tech and design and other things who come out of the Twin Cities theater world are still working it, because there's a really, really active theater scene in the Twin Cities. So so there's actually a lot of connections between us and the theater world. So and we like, those are kind of skills that I don't have as a historian. Like I don't know how to light something. Like I don't necessarily think that much about textures or colors, or how do we like what you want to reveal first and reveal second and things like that. So so that was kind of a rambly answer to all of that, but
no, it was great. And I think the one theme I think we're all going to talk about when we're done here is how collaborative the work you're doing seems to be. You're working with so many different people and such a team to make these things happen. And I think that's just been so obvious and impressive. I know we've kept you quite a bit longer than we agreed, so I'd like to ask one final question, if that's okay. Sure. I found you on Twitter, right? I follow you on Twitter. I love the work that you do there, and a lot of the graphic work that you do, I think is so good and fun and serious all at the same time. But one of the things that we talk about in this class is the public work of historians as kind of public intellectuals, whether it's Twitter or some of those other spaces, op-eds and things like that. And just, do you have any final thoughts or ideas about the role of historians in that space, in a space like Twitter or other, really public venues? Because in that space, you get people, who wouldn't walk into a history museum, you know, that you're trying to be a part of that conversation. And how involved should historians be in the current conversations about life and politics and all of that, and from a historical perspective or not?
Well, like, to me, like, historians should be as active as they want to be. And a lot of this depends obviously on what you study. And I'll be honest, because like my intellectual background is I do contemporary American history, I do kind of urban policy and urban planning. And, you know, so I'm not doing things that are, like my medievalist friends sometimes might have a little bit more of a jump, but I'm just like, let me tell you why that building is there. I can do that. Like, so from the beginning, I was like specializing in things that have kind of an immediate, have an immediate impact that, where I can talk about, like, hey, like, I'm talking about things that are actually still being decided and are in process. And then when, I'll be honest, I didn't actually start getting into Twitter until about 2 years ago. But before that, like my jobs, particularly at History Colorado, was to be a public intellectual for the state. Like, as assistant state historian, I did a lot of public speaking. I published some things like in kind of local media. I did like documentaries and other things. And like it was an innate part of my job. So I've never like, from starting with kind of more contemporary history to becoming kind of more of a kind of, doing a lot of public speaking, doing a lot of public facing work, being able to kind of, a lot of my job at History Colorado was being able to, like, we get a call from some station saying we need somebody to talk about X in 2 days. And, me and the other historian, like, we split up. We each had very different areas, but figuring out like, all right, what do I need to research really quick? Because what do they want to know? Being able to do that really quickly and speak authoritatively is, something I had to learn on the job. So I don't really have any so I'm used to it. And I feel like, like talking to non-historians is actually like extremely rewarding. And like, I mean, a lot of like the best audiences I've ever had have been extremely like ones you wouldn't expect. Like, I think my best speaking engagement ever was to a group of retired state and federal employees who met in like this VFW hall and had a hot dog buffet before my speech. And it was so weird, and I didn't know what to expect anyway. And I'm like, they're giving me these hot dogs, but then we talked, and they were like so sharp, and they had great questions. And they were super engaged, and it was a great. And I got all these free hot dogs too, so it was great. But like my job now is, even though I'm the spokesperson for each exhibit, like we work on like 2 to 3 year cycles, So Twitter was a way for me to kind of like get more into like, like putting my name out there, like engaging in debates, mostly I actually engage a lot more in the museum field than in the history field, mostly because, like that's usually what's on my mind, is thinking about how museums work, what do we need to do better. And museum Twitter is is very vocal and very engaged in one another. So I've done it. It's been a huge like draw for me. Just like I've learned a lot as a professional just by being on Twitter, but also just kind of being able to talk to other historians, being able to just like hey, here's something weird I found out there, is like I mean, like the more people you can engage with the work you do, the better off like we all are. So it's basically the short version of that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was great. Well, Erin, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. And
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very helpful and interesting. And I know that they're going to be talking about you for a long time to come in a good way.
Okay.
Well, right. Good. Do you guys say thank you? I don't know how we do that virtually, but
thank you for being such a great audience, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Erin. I appreciate it. You have a good night. I hope it doesn't get too cold too fast for you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Somewhere. There it is.
I know, sorry. All right, she was great, huh? Good. Well, let's take a break. You guys want 10 minutes? Okay, go get something to drink, all of that, and we'll come back in 10 minutes then. All right, thanks, guys.
Hey Hunter, what's up?
Not too much, just living life, watching some YouTube, you know, enjoying everything that's happening.
Nice. Me too. What you watch on YouTube?
I'm watching about the Ryzen 5000 series CPUs that are dropping pretty soon.
Oh,
It's pretty exciting
computer
stuff.
stuff.
It's pretty exciting stuff, yeah. I know. It's fascinating for the wide majority of people. Anybody want an old 2070, by the way? I'm probably going to get a new graphics card soon. Anybody want a 2070? Yeah.
I do.
I could probably get you a discount.
I do.
You got some takers.
I'm poor.
I have to wait for the 38. I have to actually get the 3080 first, then I'll probably sell it for real cheap, like 100 to a friend like you.
Whoa. My Jewish upbringing just came into full view there. Never mind. I'm muting again.
Oh dear. He profiled himself.
If not, I'll probably just sell it to my roommate. He'll probably want it too. But yeah, I'm just gonna. I want the 3080, guys. It looks so good. Oh my gosh.
Is it?
Oh my gosh. Any nerds in the crowd? Come on. That stuff is insane.
No, but I guess I support your endeavors. My computer.
Listen, man, we're nerds, but we're not that much nerds. Or we're not nerds like that.
Dunked on
fair
him.
enough.
No
Fair
one's as
enough.
nerdy as Hunter.
You got a green screen and everything. That's like so advanced.
Yeah, it's nice. I like it.
Are you a streamer?
Yeah, I do streaming. I do some YouTube recording and stuff like that. That's why it's up.
God. That's
I coach.
Basically the 2020 equivalent to like a celebrity. You're a
No,
streamer?
I'm very low. I am not by any means a celebrity. I get a couple views. That's it. I do coaching in a video game called Smite. I know the nerdiness continues. So I do some coaching in a video game. And so I upload some VODs and some like advanced strategy type stuff to YouTube to help